Today in the EU, everything we know about cable-cutting incidents in the Baltic Sea.
I'm deeply concerned about the security situation in Europe. We are not at war, but we are not at peace either.
Leaders meet today to coordinate on how to better defend the Baltic Sea after the latest incident. On Christmas Day, 4 internet cables and 1 power transmission cable that crossed that body of water were cut. And if they're right, this attack marks a step up in the Kremlin's warfare strategy. So why is this happening now, 3 years into the war? And what can history teach us about Russian warfare? Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Giada Santana, and this is Today in the EU. I'm here in the studio with Euractiv's defense editor, Aurelie Pugnet. Hi, Aurelie. Welcome back.
Hi, Giada.
Niko Kurmayer, our energy and environment reporter, joins in from our renewable conference in Abu Dhabi. Thank you, Niko, for being with us. And because this is too good a story to miss out on any piece of the puzzle, really, I'm talking to historian Vladislav Zubok just later, after this. We'll discuss how Kremlin's warfare has changed since the Cold War. So today, the leaders of Baltic countries that are part of NATO are meeting in Finland to talk security. Who's there and why is it happening now?
So today, a lot of prime ministers and presidents, so really the highest political level of all those countries that surround the Baltic Sea, so we're talking Nordic and Baltic countries, are meeting in Finland, and they're having a meeting about what to do to better protect those critical infrastructure that are under sea. So we're not just talking about cables. You know, cables is a word that we hear a lot. Oh, cables got cut. We're talking really about power cables, telecom cables. We're also talking about pipelines. That's also a big deal. And they're meeting to see how can they better, the keywords are monitor and surveil the Baltic Sea to avoid more damage and more attacks, if there are indeed attacks, on those really what we call critical infrastructure. So those means to actually have power and actually have energy coming into their countries.
Russia's on the table as well, right?
Obviously, their meeting is linked to Russia having a huge role in damaging cables, damaging infrastructure in general, and specifically Russia's shadow fleet.
And when looking into the motive of this act of sabotage, many have pointed out that this is happening as Baltic states move away from Russia and Belarus' electricity grid to join the Central European one. Niko, how does this constitute motive for the Kremlin?
These power lines that connect them to the Russian continental grid are essentially the last vestiges of Soviet occupation. And at the same time, yes, there are some power flows. Commercial exchange stopped a few years ago, but sometimes Russian power plants will send electricity to, let's say, Belarus through the Baltics territory. That's just the way electricity works. If there's lines, they will be used. But today, these cables that connect them are more of a vector for hybrid attacks. So attacks on the grid stability. It was in 2023 that now EU chief diplomat, at the time she was Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, said, quote, being on the Russian electricity grid is a risk for Estonian consumers.
So in tangible terms now, has the S-Link 2 incident led to power shortages, or does Estonia have enough spare capacity to offset? How has this danger translated for the country?
So prices did spike when the cable was cut. They spiked 5-fold on the short term because the system was just not expecting that kind of disruption. But usually there's enough slack in the system. Technical engineers are a very conservative profession and have an N+1 approach, meaning that there's always much more capacity available than is technically needed, so they could make up for it. But the more of these fall away, managing the grid becomes harder and harder. And eventually, the more lines get cut or the more capacity gets destroyed, at some point, you just run out of options.
And these cuts have been done, allegedly, by Russia's shadow fleet. Aurelie, what does that mean exactly?
So what we talk about Russia's shadow fleet, it's about tankers, ships basically that carry oil for Russia that are actually hailing the flag of another country because Russia is under sanction and is not allowed to sell its oil above a specific price, which is $60 a barrel. So they are also seeing how they can tackle this fleet, how they can increase sanctions on Russia, and that will be a big deal over the next few months in discussions, both at the EU level, but I'm sure also in capitals bilaterally.
I'm sure this meeting also has to do with triggering incident, if we can call it that happened on the 25th of December related to the cutting of cables in the Baltics. All pieces of evidence lead to the Kremlin's doing.
Finnish authorities are investigating whether a ship which left a Russian port may have damaged a power cable connecting Finland and Estonia. Finnish authorities have described the incident as grave sabotage.
Our message is quite clear. We've got the situation under control. It's too soon to draw conclusions yet why this happened. We know who did it.
What do we know so far about it?
So what we know is that on Christmas Day, a power cable was cut and several telecom cables were damaged. What we know is that authorities realized that there was a ship, which we've heard a lot of, the Eagle S, that had been apparently dragging its anchor at the bottom of the sea for about 100 kilometers, and that had cut and damaged the cable. Dragging the anchor of a ship at the bottom of a sea is not something that you don't notice when you're on a ship. It's something that could be easily deliberate. It's something that is listed as kind of easy ways sort of to actually damage those undersea infrastructure and seabed infrastructure.
At the same time, it's quite common for fishing vessels to unintentionally break undersea cables. So what evidence do we have that it was intentional?
It could be unintentional, exactly. The thing is, that's the whole thing about those types of attacks or so-called sabotage, is that it's very difficult to actually pinpoint it on someone and actually say, oh, you did this. In this case in particular, the authorities say they have evidence that the ship had done it. And so they're trying to find more information as to how it happened and whether it was actually intentional. One of the clues that has been mentioned is the fact that this ship is apparently linked to Russia. And so obviously, whenever we talk about Russia, there is this, I don't want to say nervousness, but obviously it piques our interest a little bit, I think. And it piques definitely the interest of the politicians. We say, well, there is a ship that we know is linked to Russia that has done some damage, apparently, on some very important infrastructure for our societies. And it's happened at this specific time, which we know is important for geopolitics between the Europeans and Russia. So this is what we know. It's very difficult, like I said, to say in those attacks or these damages or those incidents who's responsible.
Yeah.
And the fact that there has been more surveillance and there has been more monitoring of what's going on in the Baltics over the past few months has already put the blame on some, or at least helped politicians suspect ships of doing wrongdoings. We heard about it in Denmark a few weeks ago as well. This is what we know. What will happen next is a big question.
What was the cargo supposed to do there?
This cargo was traveling to St. Petersburg in Russia. It's involved in oil trading and delivering, and it was apparently just doing its job. Whether it's been giving orders to actually change its mission or just casually break a cable on its way in or out is another question that we don't necessarily have the answer for. But what we know is that politicians have called it sabotage.
Yeah.
And it's a very strong act because you do already say this is not normal and we're going to investigate and we're going to make sure that those kinds of incidents are not just forgotten about. And it will trigger a response and it will trigger more information gathering and just more attention, basically, from the politicians in the region, hence also this meeting that's happening today.
At the same time, with the decoupling of the Baltics' energy needs from Russia's, which has been in the making for, 10 years, we could have seen an attack of this kind coming, and correct me if I'm wrong. But what do you make of the EU's defense strategy then? Are we too late? Should have we been more prepared? How are we preparing for the future?
I think in general, we can say that there's definitely, if not little preparation, at least it's not very public in terms of preparation when it comes to those incidents or attacks that would not meet the threshold of a military attack.
Yeah.
So the military people, they would call them hybrid attacks. That's a word you use a lot, that we use a lot, that we hear a lot. It's basically a cyber attack. It can be a terrorist attack. It can be instrumentalization of migration. It depends on who you are in Europe. So you use different examples. There's quite a lack of preparation because simply, first of all, they're new-ish. And also, it's very tricky to actually figure out what do you do in response. In terms of a military attack, it's pretty easy to figure out, okay, who's responsible? I mean, the tanks come from this country. You're attacking me. I will call NATO, ask for mutual defense, and all my friends from the NATO military alliance will come help me and defend myself against Russia or whoever else is attacking me on land.
Yeah, it's easy to connect the dots.
It's easy to connect the dots, absolutely. It's easy to make the puzzle. But when it comes to an incident on, like you were saying, on the cables, what do we know? We know a lot of facts, but actually being able to puzzle those together and actually make a full sentence that actually says Russia is responsible for this or China is responsible for this, for example, is a lot more difficult. So there is definitely a strategy we see now in more monitoring and surveillance of the Baltic Sea, which is very important in terms of connecting countries because of all those cables that live under sea.
And so what can NATO do in tangible terms?
What they can actually do besides adding more ships, submarines, drones, it's a bit difficult to say, isn't it?
Niko, do you think we have to foresee more attacks? It really sounds like it from what you said before.
Well, while we're writing the story, the Swedish Civil Protection Authority actually told the media that a ship that they'd stopped in November 2024, the Yipeng, had also potentially perhaps been trying to cut another one of the Baltic cables, the so-called Nordbalt cable that connects the Baltics to Sweden. And yes, I do expect as we go in the run-up to the 8th February date that there might be potentially one other cable attack, for example, on the Litpol link. That's an on-land power line connecting Lithuania to Poland.
And why that one specifically?
That essentially is the essential cable for the process because it connects the continental European grid to that of the Baltics. That is the lifeline right through the Suwalki Gap, Kaliningrad to the west, Belarus to the east. That one is the cable.
So, Aurelie, what are NATO countries doing to make sure this doesn't happen?
Obviously, some countries are pushing for harder sanctions on Russia because they say if we lower the price cap, maybe it would also more cripple Russia's war machine and really help taking it down to its knees. At the end of the day, those incidents are very worrying because the Baltic Sea is not what some people call the NATO lake when all the countries around the Baltic Sea joined NATO a year ago.
What is the Baltic Sea then?
The Baltic Sea is a sea in which there is passage for a lot of ships that are not only NATO ships. And it's a sea that is quite big. It doesn't look like it on a map, but monitoring everything that's going on is going to take a lot of resources. And thinking that we can know everything that happens there, it's very optimistic. It's great. But you can also imagine that if you have to monitor a cable that is also owned by a private company, does this private company agree with that? How do I know that you're not also plugging into this cable? If you put higher standards on the cables in the Baltic Sea or on certain operators, commercially, great, but then is there a level playing field that's matched in other parts of the world? I think what we see in the Baltic Sea is showing us what could happen in other parts of the world.
Interesting.
And so, for example, we've talked about Greenland quite a bit lately.
Yeah.
Greenland has one cable between Greenland and Iceland. If this cable were to be severed, what would happen to Greenland on telecoms? I don't know. Maybe they have access to space and other ways to get information and things like that. But what I'm trying to say is we can't know everything that's going on anywhere because, first of all, there's a lot to monitor, but there are priorities that can be set.
Yeah.
And what we'll hear today is at least a political statement from many, many leaders around the Baltic Sea to obviously put more attention on it and avoid those kinds of issues repeating. But if it's not happening in the Baltic Sea, there's a high chance it will happen somewhere else.
And so when it comes to Estonia and the S-Link 2 incident, how long will it take for flows to resume?
Well, there's an official estimate of until July, but it might well be late August. Anyhow, it's going to be in the second half of 2025. Very few specialized ships can conduct these highly technical subsea cable repairs, and these ships are in high demand.
And what could be the impact because of the scarcity of this type of vessel if we were to witness more cables being cut before February, as you just mentioned?
Worst case scenario, we might have to delay the synchronization. I mean, that would be a major success for the Russians or whoever is conducting or organizing these attacks. Baltics are trying to synchronize to the continental European grid to sort of signify their independence and their desire for a secure power grid. If these hybrid attacks can delay or hamper that process, that is probably already a win for whoever is conducting, organizing, or ordering them.
Thank you, Niko.
Thank you.
As things look right now, the EU has some evidence of sabotage on the side of the Kremlin, but no certainties nor a plan, at least publicly, on how to defend itself. Looking for answers, I turned to history. I asked Cold War historian Vladislav Zubok what he made of the cable-cutting incidents in the Baltic Sea. Vladislav, what does history teach us about the strategy of cable cutting? Is it something we saw during the Cold War?
My impression is that during the Cold War, that practice was actually not prevalent or not widespread. I'm not so sure about World War II and World War I, but most of the time, of course, intelligence services used those cables and the communications for purpose of intercepting signals. That was always more, let's say, advantageous to use the cable for one's own purposes.
And do we have any evidence regarding even preparation for this type of strategy?
During the Cold War, as it became clear towards the end of the 1940s, that there are two blocks and Europe is divided. So people expected a World War III. People expected a hot war at the end of the 40s. And the military, being the military, they always think about the previous war. They made all kinds of preparations for it. So although most of these plans are still classified, we have enough peek into the declassified information to say that, of course, the military on the both sides envisaged all kinds of sabotage towards the opposite side, destruction of cables, various blowing up depots, the fuel storages, whatnot.
Right. And that included cables.
That, of course, including cables. But fortunately, the Cold War is called for a reason in Europe. So to cut civilian cables, that I think it was never part of the Kremlin policies at the time. Yes, they were part of the preparations for a future war, and in case it breaks out, all the hell would break loose. But while nothing starts yet, people in the Kremlin thought that would be too disruptive and too dangerous to do anything like that. And the same, of course, on the Western side.
What you're saying here is very important. I mean, it adds a certain level of attention that we should pay to the most recent incidents because they are an escalation compared to everything else we've seen so far.
As we begin to look at the current events, for me, at least as a Cold War historian, what's important here is that basically the practice of signaling your intent, your preparedness through nuclear weapons. So nukes were a kind of a universal indicator of your capacity and readiness to escalate. What does it tell us today? The plus, the positive side of the story that we no longer have nukes. as during 22 and 23, when the Russian leadership made such vague but unmistakable signals that they're prepared to use nuclear weapons, right? And that was done, well, if you like, to scare the public, but also to send the signals to the NATO countries and the leadership of the NATO countries. Well, you watch it. This is something new, in my view, to send a signal, to raise the level of ambiguity through conventional means. For instance, you begin to cut civil communications like this cable, and it can be read in two ways. Wait, you had done it to us already by destroying the Nord Stream. And we here go back to this revelation by Wall Street Journal, right? On September 22, sabotage on Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. So, okay, apparently it involved the Poles and the Ukrainians, or at least the Ukrainians. Now, if we read this sabotage as something that was done by the opposite side, by the Kremlin, we have to take it to context of signaling. Basically, you had done it to us before. We took it. We cannot do anything now. But now we're responding in some way to give you a sort of a gist of what might happen if you continue to escalate along these lines against us.
A form of retaliation.
A form of retaliation, as is always in these cases, it's in the eye of the beholder. How do you interpret it? It's highly aggressive, but also can be viewed as tit for tat. And some would even say, okay, that's the way to prevent further escalation. So as always, during the Cold War, there were two groups of people. What do the Soviets want? They react, or they really want to go to World War III. And today we have the same kind of a game. Is it like something that Moscow wants to show in a way of escalation, short of using nuclear threats, to prepare for ultimate negotiations, armistice negotiations or whatever negotiations in the future? Some hawkish interpreters, analysts may say, "Oh well, it's Russia. Look, that's Russia is on the road to more aggressive acts, and if we deal with Russia now, then Putin may do whatever, may cut all the cables leading between Finland and Estonia and invade Estonia." Well, you can have all kinds of wild interpretations of the same kind of event, because there's a lot of fog of war, that's a lot of obscurity, and both sides deny their involvement, of course, in sabotage acts that take place in the Baltic Sea.
And so what do you make of this Baltic Sea hostilities?
But it's something new that we call a hybrid warfare, when all those old rules of signaling and escalation that had been applied during the Cold War no longer work.
Right.
And a new escalation ladder almost has to be invented in this sort of experimental way. And that of course, is highly dangerous, because towards the end, at least, of the Cold War, everyone learned the rules. When Reagan in 1983 learned through British intelligence that the Politburo was scared of NATO exercises, okay, Reagan decided to give a peaceful speech, right? So that was an understandable world for policymakers with more or less clear rules. Now we are much less certain of what the other side wants to communicate, to send to us, what kind of signal the other side is sending. And that, for me, is rather disconcerting.
Thank you, Vladislav. This was Euractiv's podcast, Today in the EU. Sound design by Miriam Sáenz de Tejada and Niels de Keokelare. Research and production by Charles Cohen. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news and sign up for our newsletters. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and your favorite streaming platforms. Don't forget to subscribe and give us a review. It will really help us spread the word about our work. See you tomorrow. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.